What do you do when your wife throws you out in front of the whole neighborhood, the gorgeous neighbor offers you shelter, and your doorbell camera reveals they've both been lying for months? My name is Owen Garrett, and I'm 34 years old, and I work as the building superintendent for a gated townhome community called Riverside Terrace, which sits along the eastern edge of the city, where the residential neighborhoods begin to give way to industrial parks and warehouse districts, and my job requires me to maintain entry logs for security purposes and to oversee repairs and to respond to resident complaints about everything from leaking faucets to noise violations to parking disputes that somehow always seem to escalate into personal feuds that require diplomatic intervention and careful documentation. I have been married to my wife Vanessa for 6 years, and we met when she was working as an event coordinator for a corporate hospitality company, and I was finishing my military service transition program that helped veterans adapt their skills to civilian employment opportunities. And Vanessa had always been organized and socially conscious, and very invested in maintaining a particular image within whatever community we happened to be living in at any given time. When we moved into Riverside Terrace 3 years ago, Vanessa immediately volunteered to coordinate community events and social gatherings and seasonal celebrations that required her to work closely with the Homeowners Association Board, and particularly with the HOA president, who controlled access codes and facility reservations and the community calendar that determined when and where residents could host private events. The HOA president is a man named Blake Henley, who is 41 years old and who works in commercial real estate development, and who has the kind of confidence that comes from always being the person in the room who controls the resources that everyone else needs. And Blake has been HOA president for 4 years, which is longer than the bylaws technically allow. But nobody ever runs against him because he has made himself indispensable through his connections with local contractors and his ability to negotiate favorable maintenance contracts and his willingness to spend hours in tedious committee meetings that most residents would rather avoid. I have interacted with Blake primarily in my capacity as building superintendent when he needs access to utility systems, or when he wants to review security procedures, or when he asks questions about entry log data that seems to go beyond normal HOA oversight responsibilities. The evening that everything changed in a way that I could not ignore or explain away as misunderstanding or coincidence was 18 days ago when I arrived home from work around 7 o'clock in the evening after spending the afternoon repairing a malfunctioning irrigation controller in the community garden area. And as I turned onto our street, I immediately noticed that there were several neighbors standing in their driveways and on their front lawns looking toward my townhome with expressions that combined curiosity and discomfort, and something that looked like embarrassment on behalf of whatever scene they were witnessing. As I drove closer, I could see that my front yard was covered with clothes and shoes and personal items that had been thrown from the porch in a scattered, chaotic pattern that suggested violent emotion rather than careful planning, and standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her face flushed with anger was Vanessa, who was yelling something that I could not yet hear clearly through my closed car windows. I parked my truck in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine still running while I tried to assess what was happening and what the appropriate response would be. And I could see Vanessa gesturing dramatically and pointing at me and then at the clothes scattered across the lawn, and I could see neighbors watching from a distance that was close enough to hear everything, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability about being actively involved in whatever domestic confrontation was unfolding. I turned off the engine and opened my door, and as soon as I stepped out of the truck, Vanessa's voice became clear and sharp as she yelled that I should not come back home, and that she was done pretending that everything was fine, and that she could not continue living with someone who was emotionally absent and who treated their marriage like a maintenance contract that only required minimal effort to keep things functioning at a basic level. I walked slowly across the lawn toward the porch without responding immediately to Vanessa's accusations, because I had learned from my military training and from my work managing conflict situations that the person who stays calm and observes carefully almost always has a strategic advantage over the person who is acting on pure emotion and adrenaline. Vanessa continued yelling about how I was cold and distant, and how I prioritized my work over our relationship, and how she deserved better than a husband who treated her like another item on a maintenance checklist. And as I bent down to begin collecting my scattered clothes from the damp grass, I noticed that Vanessa kept glancing at her phone, which was sitting on the porch railing beside her, and which appeared to be receiving messages or notifications that she was monitoring even while maintaining her performance of righteous anger. Several of our neighbors had moved closer now, and were standing in small clusters along the sidewalk and in adjacent driveways, and I recognized Mrs. Patterson from 2 doors down and Mr. Rourke, the elderly man who lived across the street and who spent most evenings sitting on his front porch watching the comings and goings of the community with the patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing more urgent to do than observe the daily rhythms of neighborhood life. I also noticed that Iris Caldwell, who lived in the townhome directly next to ours, had come out onto her front steps and was watching the scene with an expression that seemed to combine concern and something else that I could not quite identify, but that made me slightly uncomfortable in a way that I did not yet have the context to understand or articulate. Iris was 29 years old and worked from home doing something related to digital marketing or social media management, and she was objectively attractive in a way that had caused some of the other wives in the community to make occasional comments about her clothing choices and her habit of sunbathing on her back patio during weekend afternoons, and Vanessa had always been dismissively friendly toward Iris in the way that people are when they want to appear inclusive and above petty jealousies, while simultaneously making sure that everyone understands the social hierarchy and who has been in the community longer and who has more influence with the HOA board. I had exchanged maybe a dozen words with Iris over the 3 years we had been neighbors, and those interactions had been limited to basic greetings and brief conversations about package deliveries or maintenance schedules or the weather. As I continued methodically collecting my clothes and folding them into neat stacks on the driveway, Vanessa's voice became louder and more shrill as she repeated that I should not come back home and that she needed space to figure out what she wanted and whether this marriage was worth saving, and I noticed that her performance felt oddly scripted in a way that reminded me of the rehearsed presentations that volunteers give at community events where they have practiced their talking points and their emotional beats and their strategic pauses for emphasis. I looked up at Vanessa and maintained eye contact without speaking, and I watched as her confidence seemed to waver slightly when I did not respond with the anger or the pleading or the defensive explanations that she had apparently been expecting. It was at that moment that Iris walked across her front lawn and approached the boundary between our properties and said in a voice that was loud enough for the watching neighbors to hear that she was so sorry I was going through this and that if I needed a place to stay tonight, I was welcome to use her guest room until I could figure out more permanent arrangements. I felt a surge of suspicion at Iris's offer, because it seemed too convenient and too perfectly timed to be purely spontaneous kindness. And I also recognized that accepting help from an attractive female neighbor, while my wife was publicly accusing me of emotional neglect, would feed into whatever narrative Vanessa was trying to establish about my character and my fitness as a husband. However, I also understood that refusing Iris's offer would leave me with limited options, since most of my close friends had moved away over the years, and my family lived several states away, and checking into a hotel would both drain my personal savings and make me look like I was running away from the situation rather than standing my ground with dignity and calm professionalism. I looked at Iris, and then at Vanessa, and then at the neighbors who were watching with barely concealed fascination, and I made a calculation that staying calm and accepting help graciously would deny Vanessa the explosive confrontation that she seemed to be trying to provoke and would preserve my reputation as someone who responded to crisis with measured rationality, rather than with the kind of volatile emotion that would validate whatever complaints she had been making about me to her friends and to the HOA board and to whoever else she had been building her case with over however many weeks or months this had been planned. I thanked Iris for her offer and said that I would appreciate having a place to stay while I sorted things out, and I saw Vanessa's expression shift from performative anger to something that looked almost like frustration or disappointment, as though my calm acceptance of exile was not the response she had been hoping to elicit. I continued gathering my clothes and my personal items from the yard, and I carried them in several trips to my truck and loaded them into the bed and covered them with a tarp that I kept for protecting equipment during transport. And throughout this process, I maintained the same methodical, unhurried pace that I would use for any other maintenance task that required attention to detail and resistance to external pressure or artificial urgency. When I had collected everything that I could see in the fading evening light, I walked back to where Iris was still standing near the property line, and I thanked her again for her kindness, and I asked if now would be a convenient time for me to bring my things over, or if she needed a few minutes to prepare the guest room. Iris said that now would be fine, and that she had been meaning to change the sheets anyway, and I detected in her voice a nervous quality that suggested she was either genuinely uncomfortable with the situation or was working very hard to appear genuine and helpful while actually serving some other agenda that I did not yet understand. I drove my truck the 30 feet from my driveway to Iris's driveway, and I began unloading my clothes and carrying them through her front door into a small, neat townhome that was decorated in the minimalist style that people adopt when they either have very specific aesthetic preferences or when they want to avoid accumulating possessions that would make relocating to a new city or a new opportunity more complicated and expensive. Iris showed me to the guest room, which was on the second floor at the end of a hallway and which contained a double bed and a small desk and a closet, and a window that looked out over the community pool area and the walking path that connected the different sections of the townhome complex. After I had brought in the last load of my belongings, Iris offered to make coffee or tea, and I accepted coffee, and we sat in her living room making awkward small talk about the weather and about some upcoming community event that Vanessa was supposed to be coordinating. And I noticed that Iris seemed to be studying me carefully, as though she was trying to assess whether I was dangerous or volatile or likely to cause problems for her by staying in her home. I assured her that I appreciated her hospitality and that I would be looking for more permanent arrangements as soon as possible, and that I understood if she changed her mind about having a neighbor going through a marital crisis staying under her roof. Iris said that it was fine, and that she was happy to help, and that she knew what it was like to feel suddenly displaced and uncertain about the future, and then she added almost casually that she used to work with Vanessa several years ago before moving to this community, and that they had maintained a friendly relationship even though they did not see each other socially very often outside of community events. This information landed in my mind with the weight of significance, even though I could not immediately articulate why it mattered or what it might mean about the situation I was now in. After Iris went upstairs to her own bedroom, and I was alone in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone and opened the security application that controlled the smart doorbell camera that I had installed at our townhome approximately 8 months ago when there had been a series of package thefts in the community, and several residents had asked me in my capacity as building superintendent whether there were any security measures they could implement without violating HOA guidelines about exterior modifications. The doorbell camera I had chosen was a standard consumer model that connected to wireless internet and stored motion-triggered video clips in a cloud storage system that could be accessed from any device with the proper login credentials. And I had installed identical units at 3 other townhomes for neighbors who had requested my help with the setup process. I had not been actively monitoring the doorbell footage on a daily basis because there had been no reason to suspect that anything unusual or concerning was happening at our home. But now, as I sat in Iris's guest room surrounded by hastily packed clothes and trying to make sense of the public confrontation that had just occurred, I felt a growing instinct that told me I should review the recent footage to see if there were any patterns or anomalies that might help me understand whether tonight's explosion had been spontaneous or whether it had been building towards some predetermined outcome that I had failed to notice because I had been focused on my work responsibilities and my maintenance schedules and my assumption that our marriage was stable even if it was not particularly passionate or emotionally demonstrative. The doorbell camera application showed a timeline view of the past 30 days with small thumbnail images marking each motion-triggered event, and I could see hundreds of clips showing me leaving for work in the morning and returning in the evening, and showing Vanessa coming and going at various times, and showing delivery drivers and postal workers and neighbors walking past on the sidewalk and occasionally stopping to ring the doorbell when they needed to speak with one of us about some community matter or borrowed tool or scheduling question. I began scrolling backward through the timeline, looking for anything that seemed out of place or unusual, and initially everything appeared normal and consistent with the daily routines that I would have expected based on my knowledge of our schedules and our habits. However, as I scrolled back further and began paying closer attention to the timestamps rather than just the thumbnail images, I noticed that there were several clips recorded between 10 o'clock at night and 4 o'clock in the morning, which was unusual because neither Vanessa nor I typically came or went during those hours except on rare occasions when I had emergency maintenance calls, or when Vanessa had evening volunteer events that ran later than expected. I tapped on the first of these late-night clips and watched as the video showed our front door opening at 2:17 in the morning and Vanessa stepping through the doorway, followed immediately by a male figure whose face was not clearly visible in the camera's night vision mode, but whose general build and height suggested someone in their late 30s or early 40s. I felt my pulse increase slightly as I watched the clip, but I maintained my habitual calm and methodical approach, and I saved the video to my phone's local storage, and then I scrolled to find the next late-night clip, which showed a similar pattern with Vanessa returning home at 2:43 in the morning, accompanied by what appeared to be the same male figure. I continued through the timeline and found 6 more clips over the span of the previous 30 days that showed Vanessa returning home between 2 and 3 in the morning with a male companion, and in 3 of those clips, I was able to pause the video at a moment when the camera's infrared illumination caught enough detail to show that the man was wearing a lanyard around his neck with what appeared to be a keycard or access badge attached. I zoomed in on the frozen frame and adjusted the contrast on my phone screen, and I could see that the badge was the same type that HOA board members carried for accessing locked community facilities and override codes for the main entrance gates. And while I could not read the specific text on the badge or identify the man's face with absolute certainty from this angle and lighting, I noted the detail carefully and added it to the growing collection of observations that I was assembling in my mind. I went back and reviewed all 8 of the late-night clips, and I paid attention to the exact timestamps, and I noticed that they occurred exclusively on evenings when I had been working late shifts or had been called out for emergency maintenance issues that required me to be away from home for several hours. I created a simple note document on my phone, and I began logging the dates and times of each late-night return, and I noted which nights corresponded with my own documented absence from home, based on my work calendar and my text message history, with residents who had requested after-hours maintenance service. And the pattern that emerged was clear and consistent, and not something that could be easily explained away as coincidence or innocent circumstances. I took screenshots of each doorbell video clip, showing the timestamps and the clearest frames of Vanessa and her male companion, and I organized these screenshots into a dedicated folder on my phone that I labeled with a simple date code that would not be immediately obvious to anyone who might casually glance at my phone screen. After I had finished reviewing and documenting the doorbell footage, I sat quietly for several minutes, thinking about what I had just discovered and what it meant about the timeline of events that had led to tonight's public confrontation in our front yard. And I realized that Vanessa's accusations about my emotional distance and my failure to prioritize our relationship had probably been part of a longer strategy to establish a narrative that would justify whatever she had been doing during those late-night hours when I had been away responding to maintenance emergencies or working overtime to complete repairs before business hours the next morning. The doorbell footage by itself was not conclusive proof of infidelity because it was theoretically possible that Vanessa had been helping a friend or colleague with some emergency or had been attending late-night volunteer planning sessions that required her to give someone a ride home, but the pattern of deception and concealment suggested something more deliberate and more systematically hidden. I remembered that, as building superintendent, I had legitimate access to the community's electronic entry log system, which tracked every keycard scan at the main gates and at secured facility entrances, including the pool area and the clubhouse and the fitness center and the individual townhome units that had been equipped with smart lock systems as part of a security upgrade that the HOA board had approved 2 years ago. The entry log system was maintained primarily for security purposes and for investigating incidents of unauthorized access or policy violations. And my superintendent credentials gave me the ability to generate reports filtered by date range or by specific keycard numbers or by specific locations within the community. I decided that I would wait until the following morning to access the entry log system because doing so from Iris's guest room using my phone would create an obvious digital trail that might be questioned later if the situation escalated into legal proceedings or formal separation negotiations. And I wanted to make sure that every piece of evidence I gathered could be defended as falling within my legitimate work responsibilities rather than being characterized as obsessive surveillance or invasion of privacy. I also recognized that I needed to be strategic about the order in which I discovered and documented information because premature confrontation based on incomplete evidence would give Vanessa an opportunity to construct alternative explanations or to destroy additional proof that might exist in other forms. I set my phone aside and lay back on the bed in Iris's guest room, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about the comment she had made about having worked with Vanessa several years ago before moving to this community. And I tried to recall whether Vanessa had ever mentioned having a former colleague living in Riverside Terrace, or whether she had ever seemed surprised or uncomfortable when Iris had first moved into the adjacent townhome approximately 18 months ago. I could not remember any specific conversations about Iris's arrival in the community beyond the usual neighborly acknowledgments and the kind of surface-level friendliness that people maintain with adjacent residents when they want to avoid conflict but have no particular interest in developing deeper social connections. The fact that Iris had offered her guest room so quickly and so publicly during tonight's confrontation now seemed less like spontaneous kindness and more like a planned intervention by someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to involve herself in whatever situation was developing between Vanessa and me. And I wondered whether Iris's past working relationship with Vanessa had been positive or negative, and whether there might be old professional grievances or personal conflicts that would motivate Iris to position herself as my ally or as someone with useful information to share. I made a mental note to ask Iris more questions about her history with Vanessa when an appropriate opportunity arose, but I also reminded myself to be cautious about trusting anything that Iris told me without independent verification, because people who insert themselves into other people's marital conflicts almost always have their own agendas that may or may not align with discovering truth or achieving fair outcomes. I eventually fell asleep still fully dressed on top of the guest room bedspread, and I woke up around 6:30 in the morning to the sound of Iris moving around downstairs in her kitchen, and I got up and washed my face in the small bathroom attached to the guest room, and I changed into clean work clothes from the pile of belongings I had hastily transported the night before. When I came downstairs, Iris was making coffee, and she offered me a cup and asked if I had slept at all, and I thanked her and said that I had managed a few hours, and that I appreciated her hospitality and her willingness to get involved in what was obviously an uncomfortable situation. Iris said that it was no problem, and that she had been in a similar position herself several years ago when a relationship had ended badly, and she had needed to find temporary housing while she sorted out her next steps. and then she added that she hoped I did not mind her saying so, but she had always thought that Vanessa seemed like someone who was very concerned with appearances, and with maintaining a certain image within the community. I found this comment interesting because it suggested that Iris had been observing Vanessa and forming opinions about her character over the 18 months that they had been neighbors, and I asked Iris what she meant specifically about Vanessa being concerned with appearances. Iris hesitated for a moment and then said that she just meant that Vanessa always seemed very involved in community events and very focused on being visible at HOA meetings and volunteer activities, and that sometimes people who are that invested in their public reputation are dealing with private insecurities or private situations that they are working very hard to keep hidden from view. I noted the careful way that Iris phrased this observation, as though she was testing whether I would be receptive to hearing more direct criticism of Vanessa, or whether I would become defensive and shut down the conversation, and I responded by saying that I thought Iris's observation was perceptive and that I had noticed similar patterns, but had not thought very deeply about what they might indicate about Vanessa's underlying motivations or concerns. I finished my coffee and told Iris that I needed to go to the building office to take care of some administrative tasks and to check on several maintenance requests that had come in over the past few days, and Iris said that I should feel free to come and go as needed, and that she would be working from home all day if I needed anything. I thanked her again and walked out to my truck and drove the short distance to the community maintenance building, which was located near the main entrance gates and which housed my small office and the storage areas for tools and supplies and equipment. I unlocked the office and sat down at the desk and logged into the entry system using my superintendent credentials, and I navigated to the reporting interface and set the parameters to show all keycard scans for the past 30 days, filtered by time range between 9 p.m. and 4 a.m. The entry log system generated a report showing 237 keycard scans during the overnight hours across the entire community over the 30-day period, and the report displayed each scan as a row in a spreadsheet format with columns showing the date and exact time and the location of the scan and the keycard identification number and the cardholder name associated with each credential. I exported the full report to a PDF file and saved it to a secure folder on the office computer, and then I began manually filtering the results to focus specifically on scans that occurred at my own townhome unit or in the immediate vicinity during the time windows that matched the doorbell camera footage I had reviewed the previous night. The filtering process took approximately 20 minutes because I had to cross-reference the location codes with the community map to make sure I was identifying the correct building clusters and unit numbers, and as I worked through the data, I felt the familiar calm focus that always came over me when I was solving a technical problem or investigating a maintenance issue that required careful attention to detail and systematic elimination of irrelevant variables. When I had completed the filtering, I was left with a subset of 8 keycard scans that had occurred at my townhome's smart lock system during overnight hours, and these 8 scans corresponded almost exactly with the timestamps from the doorbell camera footage showing Vanessa returning home with her male companion. I clicked on the keycard identification numbers to view the cardholder information, and the first 2 scans showed my own keycard number, which made sense because I had returned home briefly on those nights after completing emergency maintenance calls at other units in the community. The remaining 6 scans all showed the same keycard number, which was registered to Blake Henley with a notation indicating that his credential had HOA board administrator privileges that allowed him override access to any locked facility or residence in the community for emergency purposes or for conducting official board inspections with proper notice to residents. I sat back in my office chair and looked at Blake's name on the screen, and I thought about the various interactions I had had with him over the past 3 years, in his capacity as HOA president and in my capacity as building superintendent. Blake had always been professionally courteous in our interactions and had generally been supportive of my maintenance recommendations and my budget requests for equipment upgrades and repair supplies, and he had occasionally asked me questions about security procedures and access protocols that I had assumed were related to his board responsibilities for oversight of community safety measures. I now realized that some of those questions had been more specific than necessary for general oversight purposes and had included inquiries about whether the entry log system tracked individual scans in real time or only generated reports on request, and whether the superintendent received automatic alerts when administrator credentials were used outside of normal business hours or in residential units rather than common facilities. I had answered Blake's questions honestly at the time because I had no reason to suspect that he was gathering information for purposes that went beyond his legitimate board functions, and I had explained that the system operated on a passive logging model that recorded all scans continuously, but only generated alerts if a credential was used more than 20 times in a single day, which would indicate possible credential theft or sharing, or if a non-administrator credential attempted to access a location outside its authorized permissions. Blake's administrator credential would not trigger any automatic alerts, regardless of how frequently it was used or where it was used within the community, because the system assumed that board administrators had legitimate reasons to access any location at any time for emergency response or official inspection purposes. I created a new document on my office computer, and I began constructing a simple timeline that showed the dates and times of Blake's keycard scans at my townhome unit, alongside the corresponding doorbell camera timestamps and my own work schedule showing when I had been called away for overnight maintenance emergencies. The pattern was clear and damning because it showed that Blake had used his administrator access to enter my home exclusively on nights when I was documented as being elsewhere in the community responding to resident calls, and the timing suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate coordination between Blake and Vanessa to ensure that his visits would not overlap with my presence in the home. I printed the timeline document and the filtered entry log report, and I placed them in a manila folder that I labeled with a simple filing code that would appear to be routine administrative documentation if anyone happened to see it on my desk, and then I locked the folder in my desk drawer and cleared my computer browser history and logged out of the entry log system. I sat quietly for several minutes thinking about what my next steps should be and what additional evidence I would need to gather before I could present a complete picture of what had been happening and how long it had been going on and what Vanessa's ultimate intentions were regarding our marriage and our shared residence and our financial entanglements. I realized that the doorbell footage and the entry logs by themselves demonstrated a pattern of secretive late-night visits, but did not necessarily prove that anything physically inappropriate had occurred during those visits, and I anticipated that if confronted with this evidence, both Vanessa and Blake would likely claim that they had been conducting legitimate volunteer planning sessions or HOA business that required privacy, and that happened to extend into late hours because of their busy daytime schedules. The fact that these planning sessions had occurred in my home rather than in Blake's home, or in the community clubhouse, or in any other neutral location would be difficult to explain innocently, but I knew from experience that people who were committed to maintaining a deceptive narrative could generate surprisingly creative explanations when faced with circumstantial evidence that fell short of absolute proof. I needed additional corroboration that would either document the nature of the relationship between Vanessa and Blake more explicitly, or would demonstrate that they had been concealing their association in ways that extended beyond the late-night home visits, and I began thinking about what other sources of evidence might exist in the normal course of daily life and financial transactions, and social interactions that would leave traces and records, and witnesses who could provide independent verification of facts and timelines. I remembered that Vanessa and I maintained a joint checking account that we used for household expenses and shared bills, and while we each also had individual accounts for personal spending, the joint account was the primary repository for regular transactions, like mortgage payments and utility bills and grocery purchases and the various other expenses that accumulated in the course of managing a household. I opened the mobile banking application on my phone and logged into the joint account, and I began scrolling backward through the transaction history looking for any charges that seemed unusual or that occurred at merchants or locations that I did not recognize from our normal spending patterns. The transaction list was long and detailed because the account had been active for the entire 6 years of our marriage, but I focused specifically on the most recent 90 days because that time frame seemed to encompass the period during which the late-night visits had been occurring based on the doorbell footage I had reviewed. As I scrolled through the transactions, I noticed several recurring charges to a merchant listed as Harbor View Boutique Hotel, which was located in the downtown district approximately 2 miles from the community, and which I recognized as one of the newer upscale establishments that catered to business travelers and tourists who wanted a more intimate alternative to the large chain hotels near the convention center. The charges were all for relatively small amounts between $18 and $25, and they were all posted during morning hours between 7 and 9 a.m., and the transaction descriptions indicated that they were for the hotel's breakfast service rather than for room charges or other amenities. I counted 12 separate breakfast charges at the Harbor View Boutique Hotel over the 90-day period, and when I cross-referenced the dates of these charges with my own work calendar, I discovered that all 12 had occurred on weekday mornings when I had been scheduled to start my superintendent shift early for projects that required access to units or facilities before residents left for work. I took screenshots of each transaction showing the merchant name and the date and the amount, and I saved these screenshots to the same secure folder on my phone where I had stored the doorbell camera images and the entry log documentation. I then opened the map application on my phone and searched for the Harbor View Boutique Hotel's address, and I was not surprised to discover that the hotel was located exactly 2 blocks from the industrial park, where I conducted many of my early morning maintenance calls and equipment inspections. I realized that Vanessa would have known my work schedule well enough to understand that I would be in that area during the morning hours on the days when these breakfast charges occurred, and the proximity of the hotel to my work location suggested either that she had been deliberately meeting someone there during times when I was nearby but occupied with other responsibilities, or that she had been sufficiently careless or confident in her concealment that she had not bothered to choose a location that was farther from my regular routes and routines. I thought about the practical logistics of these hotel breakfast meetings, and I tried to construct a timeline that would account for how Vanessa would have gotten from our town home to the downtown hotel and back, without my noticing her absence or without raising questions from neighbors who might have seen her leaving during early morning hours. I remembered that Vanessa's volunteer coordinator position with the Community Events Committee was technically a paid part-time role that gave her flexible scheduling and that often required her to meet with vendors and venue managers and other stakeholders outside of normal business hours, and she had frequently mentioned having early breakfast meetings or late evening planning sessions that I had accepted without question because they seemed consistent with the legitimate demands of her work. I now understood that Vanessa had been using her flexible work schedule and her volunteer responsibilities as cover for a parallel set of activities that had nothing to do with community events or HUA business, and I felt a cold clarity settling over me as I recognized that I had been systematically deceived over a period of months, not through elaborate lies or complex fabrications, but through simple misdirection and through my own willingness to accept surface explanations without demanding deeper verification or questioning inconsistencies that I had not been looking for, because I had no reason to suspect that my wife was living a double life. I closed the banking application and sat in my office chair staring at the wall where I had hung a large map of the community showing all the building clusters and common facilities and utility access points, and I thought about the yard confrontation from the previous evening and how carefully staged it had seemed, and how Vanessa's accusations about my emotional distance and my failure to prioritize our relationship had felt like rehearsed lines from a script that she had been preparing to deliver at the right moment. I realized that the public nature of the confrontation had been deliberate, and that Vanessa had been establishing a narrative for the neighbors and for the HOA board and for whatever legal proceedings might follow, and that narrative would cast her as the long-suffering wife who had finally reached her breaking point with a cold and neglectful husband who cared more about his building maintenance responsibilities than about his marriage. The timing of the confrontation also made more sense now because I understood that Vanessa had probably been planning to end our marriage for some time and had been waiting for the right opportunity to create a clean break that would allow her to claim moral high ground and victim status, rather than having to admit that she had been conducting an affair with the HOA president, while her husband was working night shifts to respond to emergency maintenance calls from the same residents whose community board president was secretly entering their superintendent's home during his absence. I realized that I needed to gather more evidence before I confronted anyone or made my discoveries public, because incomplete documentation would give both Vanessa and Blake opportunities to construct alternative narratives or to claim that I was misinterpreting innocent circumstances through the lens of paranoid jealousy. I decided that my next priority should be to find someone who could provide independent corroboration of the relationship between Vanessa and Blake from a neutral perspective that would carry credibility if the situation eventually required formal documentation or legal proceedings. And I thought about the various residents in the community who might have observed interactions between Vanessa and Blake during HSA meetings or community events or in the common areas where people naturally encountered each other during the course of daily life. The person who immediately came to mind was Mr. Edward Rourke, who lived in the townhome directly across the street from my unit and who spent most of his evenings sitting on his front porch reading or watching the neighborhood activities with the patient attention of someone who had retired from a long career and now found entertainment and purpose in observing the small dramas and routines of community life. Mr. Rourke was 67 years old and had moved to Riverside Terrace approximately 5 years ago after his wife had passed away from cancer, and he had decided that he no longer wanted to maintain the large suburban house where they had raised their children, and he had chosen this community specifically because it offered maintenance-free living and a sense of security and the opportunity to be surrounded by neighbors without being required to participate in constant social activities or committee obligations. I had interacted with Mr. Rourke numerous times in my capacity as building superintendent because he was meticulous about reporting maintenance issues and was always courteous and appreciative of prompt service. And he had occasionally made comments that suggested he paid close attention to the patterns of who came and went in the neighborhood and who seemed to be visiting whom with unusual frequency. I left my office and drove across the community to Mr. Rourke's street, and I parked my truck in front of his townhome, and I walked up the front path and knocked on his door, and after a moment I heard his footsteps approaching and the door opened to reveal Mr. Rourke wearing reading glasses and holding a folded newspaper, as though I had interrupted him in the middle of reviewing the morning headlines. He greeted me by name and asked if there was a maintenance issue that needed attention, and I explained that I was not there in my official capacity, but rather wanted to ask him a few questions about something I had observed in the neighborhood if he had a few minutes to spare. Mr. Rourke looked at me carefully with an expression that suggested he understood that this was not going to be a casual conversation about weather or community events, and he stepped back from the doorway and invited me inside and gestured toward his living room where we could sit and talk privately. His townhome was neat and simply furnished with the kind of comfortable, well-worn furniture that people accumulate over decades of marriage and family life, and there were framed photographs on the walls showing what I assumed were his children and grandchildren at various ages and life stages. We sat down in facing armchairs, and Mr. Rourke set his newspaper aside and folded his hands in his lap and waited for me to explain what had brought me to his door on a weekday morning. I began by acknowledging that what I was about to ask might seem unusual and might put him in an uncomfortable position, but that I was trying to understand some circumstances that had developed in my personal life, and I believed he might have information that would help me determine whether my observations and concerns were based on legitimate evidence or whether I was misinterpreting innocent situations. Mr. Rourke nodded slowly and said that he appreciated my directness and that he would do his best to answer any questions I had as long as he could do so honestly and without feeling that he was being asked to participate in spreading gossip or making judgments about other people's private affairs. I asked Mr. Rourke whether he had noticed any unusual activity around my townhome during evening hours over the past several weeks or months, and specifically whether he had observed anyone other than Vanessa and myself coming or going from the residence during late hours when most of the neighborhood was quiet and settled for the night. Mr. Rourke was silent for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his response carefully. And then he said that yes, he had in fact noticed some activity that had struck him as somewhat unusual, though he had not given it a great deal of thought at the time, because he generally tried to avoid being the kind of neighbor who monitored other people's comings and goings with excessive interest or concern. He explained that his habit was to sit on his front porch most evenings between 8 and 10 o'clock reading or simply watching the street and the sky, and enjoying the quiet transition from day to night, and during these evening sessions, he had on multiple occasions observed Vanessa leaving our townhome around 9 o'clock and walking toward the community pool area, which was located at the far end of our street cluster. Mr. Rourke said that in itself this would not have been particularly noteworthy, because many residents used the pool facilities during evening hours, but what had caught his attention was that Blake Henley had also been walking toward the pool area at approximately the same times on the same evenings, and that while they had not been walking together, they had both been heading in the same direction within a few minutes of each other in a pattern that had repeated itself enough times to register in his memory as something more than random coincidence. I asked Mr. Rourke how many times he had observed this pattern, and whether he had noticed any other details about these evening walks toward the pool area, and he thought carefully before responding that he had seen the pattern at least 6 or 7 times over the past 2 months, and that what had made it memorable was that Blake would typically arrive at the pool gate a minute or two after Vanessa and would use his administrator keycard to unlock the gate even though the pool was technically closed and locked after 9 o'clock in the evening. Mr. Rourke said that he had assumed at the time that Blake and Vanessa were conducting some kind of HOA committee business, or were inspecting the pool facilities for maintenance issues, or were having planning discussions in a quiet location away from the more heavily trafficked common areas. I asked whether Mr. Rourke had ever seen Blake and Vanessa return from the pool area together or separately, and at what times these returns typically occurred, and he said that his own routine was to go inside around 10 o'clock, so he had not personally witnessed their return trips, but he had on one occasion gotten up during the night to get a glass of water and had happened to glance out his bedroom window, which faced the street, and had seen Blake walking back toward the main parking area where board members kept their vehicles around 11:30 at night. Mr. Rourke added that he had not thought much about any of this until now, because Blake's position as HOA president would naturally require him to have access to facilities after hours and to meet with committee volunteers at irregular times, but he acknowledged that the repeated pattern in the late hours did seem somewhat unusual in retrospect. I thanked Mr. Rourke for his honesty and for his willingness to share these observations with me, and I explained that I was trying to piece together a timeline of events that might help me understand some significant changes that had recently occurred in my personal circumstances. I then asked whether Mr. Rourke would be willing to write down a brief factual statement describing what he had observed, including approximate dates and times, and the specific details about the pool gate meetings, and I emphasized that I was not asking him to make any judgments or interpretations about what the observations meant, but only to document what he had actually seen with his own eyes as a neutral witness. Mr. Rourke considered this request carefully and asked whether such a statement might eventually be used in legal proceedings or divorce filings, and I answered honestly that I did not yet know what direction my situation would take, but that having a documented witness statement would help me make informed decisions about how to proceed and would provide verification of facts that might otherwise be dismissed as speculation or jealous suspicion. Mr. Rourke nodded and said that he understood, and that while he generally preferred not to involve himself in other people's private matters, he also believed that truth and accurate documentation were important, and that if I was being deceived or misled, then I had a right to know the facts. He stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of his living room and pulled out a piece of plain white paper and a pen, and he sat back down and spent several minutes writing in careful, clear handwriting while I waited quietly and looked at the family photographs on his walls. When he finished writing, he read over what he had written and then handed the paper to me, and I saw that he had composed a brief paragraph stating that on multiple occasions between approximately late March and early May of this year he had observed Vanessa Garrett and Blake Henley walking separately toward the community pool area around 9 o'clock in the evening, and that Blake had used his administrator keycard to access the locked pool gate shortly after Vanessa's arrival, and that these observations had occurred from his vantage point on his front porch on at least 6 separate evenings, though he could not recall the exact dates. At the bottom of the statement, Mr. Rourke had signed his full name and written the current date, and I asked if I could take a photograph of the signed statement with my phone for my records, and he agreed, and I carefully photographed the document, making sure that the lighting was clear and that all the text was legible. I thanked Mr. Rourke again and told him that I appreciated his integrity and his willingness to provide this information, even though it might be uncomfortable or might create tension in the neighborhood if word got out that he had been documenting observations about the HOA president's activities. Mr. Rourke said that he was not particularly concerned about neighborhood politics or social tensions, because at his age and in his circumstances he had very little to lose from speaking truth, when asked to do so by someone who deserved honest answers. As I was preparing to leave, Mr. Rourke added one more detail that he said he had just remembered, which was that during one of his evening porch sessions, he had overheard Blake speaking on his phone while walking toward the pool area, and Blake had said something about volunteer coordination schedules that had struck Mr. Rourke as odd, because Blake's tone had seemed more intimate and personal than what you would expect from a discussion about committee logistics and scheduling. Mr. Rourke said he had not been deliberately eavesdropping, but sound carried clearly across the quiet street during evening hours, and Blake had not been making any particular effort to keep his voice down or to maintain privacy during his phone conversation. I filed this additional detail in my memory and thanked Mr. Rourke once more before leaving his townhome and returning to my truck. And as I sat in the driver's seat reviewing the photograph of his witness statement on my phone, I felt a sense of methodical progress as the various pieces of evidence began to form a coherent pattern that would be difficult to explain away as misunderstanding or innocent coincidence. I now had doorbell camera footage showing late-night entries into my home, entry log data proving that Blake had used his administrator credentials to access my residence during my documented absences, bank transaction records showing regular breakfast meetings at a downtown hotel during my early work shifts, and a signed witness statement from a neutral neighbor confirming repeated late evening meetings between Vanessa and Blake at the community pool area. I realized that I still needed one more category of evidence that would connect these various data points into a clear timeline and would demonstrate that the deception had been systematic and prolonged rather than recent or spontaneous. I realized that I still needed one more category of evidence that would connect these various data points into a clear timeline and would demonstrate that the deception had been systematic and prolonged rather than recent or spontaneous. And I began thinking about what other documentary traces might exist that would show coordination between Vanessa and Blake, or would reveal communications and planning that extended beyond what could be explained as legitimate HOA committee work or volunteer coordination responsibilities. I knew that I could not access Vanessa's personal phone or email accounts without violating privacy laws and without creating evidence that could be challenged or excluded if the situation eventually moved into legal proceedings, but I also knew that there were other sources of information that existed in shared digital spaces or in records that I had legitimate access to as either a spouse or as a building superintendent with administrative responsibilities. I drove back to the maintenance office and logged into the community's shared calendar system, which was used to schedule common facility reservations and to coordinate maintenance work and to track HOA committee meetings and community events. And this calendar system was accessible to all residents through a web portal, but had different permission levels depending on whether someone was a regular resident, or a committee volunteer, or a board member, or a building administrator like myself. I navigated to the calendar view for the past 90 days, and I filtered the display to show only entries that had been created or modified by either Vanessa's user account or Blake's user account. And the system generated a list of approximately 40 calendar entries that included community events and pool maintenance closures and HOA board meetings and various committee planning sessions. Most of these calendar entries appeared to be legitimate and consistent with the normal operations of community management and volunteer coordination, but as I reviewed the list more carefully, I noticed that there were several entries labeled generically as volunteer coordination meeting, or event planning session, that had been created by Blake's administrator account, but had only Vanessa listed as an attendee, and these entries were scheduled for evening time slots between 7 and 9 o'clock on dates that I recognized from my own work calendar as nights when I had been scheduled for late maintenance calls or emergency repairs. I clicked on each of these entries to view the full details, and I discovered that, while most legitimate committee meetings included location information specifying the clubhouse or the pool office or some other common facility, these particular entries had no location specified or had vague descriptions like TBD or offsite that did not provide any meaningful information about where the meetings were supposed to occur. I took screenshots of each of these suspicious calendar entries showing the date and time and the attendee list and the lack of specific location information, and I added these screenshots to my growing evidence folder with notes indicating that the pattern of evening meetings between Blake and Vanessa with no specified location corresponded closely with the timeline of late-night home visits documented by my doorbell camera and with the hotel breakfast charges documented in our joint bank account. I then exported the full 90-day calendar as a PDF file so that I would have a complete record that could not be modified or deleted after the fact, and I saved this PDF to the same secure folder where I was maintaining all of my other documentation. As I was reviewing the calendar export, I noticed something else that struck me as significant, which was that many of the legitimate committee meetings that included multiple attendees and specific location information had been followed within a day or two by one of the vague two-person evening sessions between Blake and Vanessa, and this pattern suggested that the legitimate committee work was being used as a foundation or cover for additional private meetings that were characterized as follow-up planning or detailed coordination, but that actually served some other purpose entirely. I created a simple comparison table in a text document showing the dates of legitimate full committee meetings in one column and the dates of the suspicious Blake-Vanessa evening sessions in an adjacent column. And the visual pattern that emerged made it clear that the private meetings were happening in a rhythm that was tied to the public committee calendar, but extended significantly beyond what would be necessary for normal volunteer coordination work. I sat back in my office chair and thought about how to interpret this calendar evidence in the context of everything else I had gathered, and I realized that what I was looking at was a systematic pattern of using legitimate community responsibilities as cover for a parallel relationship that had been carefully structured to avoid detection by creating plausible explanations for every contact and every meeting and every communication between Blake and Vanessa. The sophistication of this deception suggested that it had been planned and maintained over an extended period rather than being a spontaneous affair that had developed suddenly and carelessly, and it also suggested that both Blake and Vanessa had been very conscious of the need to maintain appearances and to avoid creating obvious evidence that would raise questions from spouses or neighbors or other committee members. I realized that I needed to understand more about Iris's claim that she had worked with Vanessa several years ago and what the nature of their professional relationship had been, and whether there was any history between them that would explain why Iris had been so quick to offer help during the yard confrontation and why she had made pointed comments about Vanessa being concerned with appearances and public image. I left the maintenance office and drove back to Iris's townhome, where I was still technically staying as a guest, even though I had spent most of the past day and a half gathering evidence and conducting interviews rather than actually occupying the guest room for any extended period of time. When I arrived at Iris's townhome, it was early afternoon, and I found her working at her dining room table with her laptop open and several notebooks spread around her and a coffee cup sitting on a coaster within easy reach, and she looked up when I entered through the front door that she had left unlocked for my convenience, and she asked if I had eaten lunch or if I needed anything from her kitchen. I thanked her and said I was fine and that I actually wanted to ask her a few questions about something she had mentioned the previous evening regarding her past working relationship with Vanessa, and Iris's expression became more guarded and more careful as she closed her laptop and turned her full attention toward me. I asked Iris to tell me more about the professional disagreement she had mentioned between herself and Vanessa when they had worked together several years ago, and specifically I wanted to know what kind of work they had been doing and what the nature of the conflict had been and whether it had been resolved or whether there were still unresolved tensions or grievances that might be relevant to understanding the current situation. Iris was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing how much information to share and how honest to be about her motivations for involving herself in my marital crisis. And finally, she said that she and Vanessa had both worked for a marketing and event management firm approximately 4 years ago, and that they had been assigned to collaborate on a major client project that involved coordinating a series of corporate hospitality events over a 6-month period. Iris explained that she had done the majority of the actual project work, including vendor negotiations and timeline management and budget tracking and problem solving when issues arose during event execution, but that Vanessa had been very skilled at managing the client relationship and presenting progress reports and taking credit during meetings and presentations in ways that made it appear that she had been the primary driver of the project's success. Iris said that when the project had been completed and had been recognized as a significant achievement for the firm, Vanessa had been promoted to senior event coordinator, while Iris had been passed over for promotion despite having done most of the substantive work. And when Iris had raised concerns about this outcome with their supervisor, she had been told that promotion decisions were based on multiple factors, including client relationship skills and leadership presence, and not just on technical execution of project tasks. Iris said that she had felt betrayed and angry about this situation, and had eventually left the firm to pursue freelance work that would allow her more control over her projects and her client relationships, and that she had not maintained contact with Vanessa after leaving the company except for occasional social media interactions that were polite but superficial. When Iris had moved to Riverside Terrace approximately 18 months ago, she had been surprised to discover that Vanessa lived in the adjacent townhome, and their initial interactions had been cordial but distant in the way that former colleagues are when they share history that includes both positive collaboration and negative outcomes. I asked Iris directly whether she had offered me her guest room during the yard confrontation because she genuinely wanted to help someone in distress, or whether she had seen an opportunity to involve herself in a situation that might allow her to settle old scores or gain some advantage over Vanessa. And Iris looked at me with an expression that combined respect for my directness and discomfort at being asked to examine her own motivations so honestly. She said that if she was being completely truthful, her decision to offer help had been motivated by a mixture of genuine sympathy for my situation and a certain satisfaction at seeing Vanessa's carefully constructed public image beginning to crack and reveal the less admirable realities that existed beneath the surface of her volunteer coordinator persona and her active community involvement. Iris added that over the 18 months of living next door to Vanessa, she had observed patterns that reminded her of their past working relationship, including Vanessa's tendency to take credit for collaborative efforts and to position herself at the center of attention during community events, and to cultivate relationships with people who had influence or authority within the HOA structure. Iris said she had not been actively looking for evidence of wrongdoing or deception, but that she had noticed Blake Henley's frequent presence around Vanessa during community gatherings and had seen them having intense, quiet conversations at events in ways that seemed more personal than professional. And she had wondered whether Vanessa was using the same relationship management skills that she had employed at the marketing firm to develop connections that would serve her own interests regardless of the impact on other people. I asked Iris whether she had any documented evidence or specific observations beyond general impressions and suspicions, and she hesitated before admitting that she had taken photographs at several community events over the past year because she worked in social media and digital marketing and was always documenting events and gatherings for potential content use, and that some of these photographs included images of Vanessa and Blake in conversation or standing close together in ways that might be worth reviewing if I was building a comprehensive picture of their relationship pattern. Iris pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her photo gallery, and after several minutes she showed me a series of images from various community events, including a summer barbecue and a holiday party, and a spring fundraiser. And in several of these images, Vanessa and Blake were positioned together at the edges of the frame in body language that suggested intimacy or private conversation rather than casual professional interaction. I asked if I could have copies of these photographs, and Iris used her phone to select the relevant images and send them to my email address, and I made note of the dates visible in the image metadata so that I could cross-reference them with my calendar and with the other timeline documentation I had been assembling. I thanked Iris for her honesty about her mixed motivations and for her willingness to share both her observations and her photographic documentation, and I acknowledged that while her desire to see Vanessa held accountable for her behavior was clearly influenced by their past professional conflict, the information and evidence she was providing was nonetheless valuable and verifiable, regardless of what personal satisfaction she might derive from contributing to Vanessa's exposure. Iris asked what I planned to do with all the evidence I was gathering and whether I was preparing for a divorce filing or for some kind of public confrontation or for a private settlement negotiation with Vanessa, and I explained that I had not yet decided on my ultimate course of action, but that my priority was to document the truth as completely and accurately as possible so that whatever decisions I made would be based on verified facts rather than on partial information or emotional reactions. I explained that I had not yet decided on my ultimate course of action, but that my priority was to document the truth as completely and accurately as possible so that whatever decisions I made would be based on verified facts rather than on partial information or emotional reactions, and I also explained that I wanted to make sure that any evidence I gathered would be defensible and legitimate if it eventually needed to be presented in legal proceedings or HOA disciplinary hearings or any other formal context where the credibility of my documentation might be challenged or questioned. Iris nodded and said that she understood my methodical approach and that it was probably the smartest strategy given that both Vanessa and Blake held positions of influence within the community and would likely have access to resources and support systems that could help them construct alternative narratives or discredit accusations that were based on incomplete evidence. I spent the next several hours sitting in Iris's guest room, organizing all of the evidence I had collected into a comprehensive timeline document that showed dates and times and locations and source materials in a format that would allow anyone reviewing the information to understand the pattern and sequence of events without requiring extensive explanation or interpretation from me. I created a simple spreadsheet with columns for date, time, location, type of evidence, source document, and brief description. And I populated this spreadsheet with entries for each piece of documentation, including the doorbell camera footage, the building entry logs, the bank transaction records, the shared calendar entries, Mr. Rourke's witness statement, and Iris's event photographs. When I had completed the initial data entry, I sorted the spreadsheet by date so that the timeline flowed chronologically from the earliest evidence to the most recent, and the pattern that emerged was clear and systematic and showed a relationship that had been ongoing for at least 3 months based on the available documentation. I also created a second document that was a narrative summary of approximately 2 pages that explained in plain language what each category of evidence demonstrated and how the different pieces of information corroborated each other and supported the conclusion that Vanessa and Blake had been conducting a concealed relationship while using their HOA committee roles and volunteer coordination responsibilities as cover for private meetings and communications that extended far beyond what would be necessary or appropriate for legitimate community work. I wrote this narrative summary in a neutral factual tone that avoided emotional language or accusations of moral wrongdoing and instead focused on documenting patterns of deception and misuse of administrator access privileges and violation of the trust that residents placed in their HOA leadership. As I was working on these documents, I received a text message from my phone from Vanessa asking when I planned to come back to the townhome to discuss separation logistics and to begin the process of dividing our shared possessions and determining how we would handle the joint lease and the various financial accounts and obligations that we had accumulated during our 6 years of marriage. The tone of her message was businesslike and practical rather than emotional or apologetic, and she suggested that we should meet at the townhome the following evening when we could have privacy and sufficient time to work through the various details that would need to be addressed. I found it interesting that Vanessa was moving quickly to establish separation procedures and to frame the situation as a mutual decision to end a marriage that had run its course rather than as a consequence of her deception and her affair with Blake, and I recognized that her eagerness to formalize the separation was probably motivated by a desire to control the narrative and to avoid deeper investigation into what had actually been happening over the past several months. I responded to Vanessa's text message saying that I would be willing to meet at the townhome the following evening, but that before we discussed separation logistics, I wanted to have a conversation about some inconsistencies and timeline questions that I had noticed in reviewing our shared financial records and calendar commitments. And I deliberately kept my message vague and non-threatening so that Vanessa would not be alerted to the extent of the evidence I had gathered or the systematic nature of my investigation. Vanessa replied almost immediately saying that she did not understand what inconsistencies I was referring to, but that we could discuss whatever questions I had when we met. And her response confirmed my suspicion that she was not expecting me to have documented proof of her activities, and was probably assuming that I would accept her general accusations about my emotional inadequacy, and would agree to a clean separation without demanding detailed explanations or accountability. I decided that before I met with Vanessa, I should make one more attempt to gather corroborating information from a source that would be considered neutral and credible, and I thought about whether there were any other residents or community members who might have observed interactions between Vanessa and Blake, or who might have information about the nature and frequency of their committee work together. I remembered that Vanessa had mentioned on several occasions working with a vendor coordinator named someone whose name I could not immediately recall, but who had been involved in arranging catering and equipment rentals for community events, and I thought that this vendor coordinator might have records or recollections of how often Vanessa and Blake had been involved in planning meetings and whether their level of collaboration seemed unusual or excessive compared to other committee volunteers. I searched through my email archives looking for messages from Vanessa about community events, and I eventually found a forwarded email chain that included correspondence with a vendor coordinator named Patricia Brennan, who apparently worked for a local event services company and who had been the primary contact for several large community gatherings over the past year. I noted Patricia's email address and phone number from the message header, and I decided that I would reach out to her to ask some general questions about HOA event planning procedures and volunteer coordination patterns, and I would frame my inquiry as being related to my building superintendent responsibilities for facility management rather than revealing that I was investigating a personal matter involving my wife. I composed a brief email to Patricia explaining that I was the building superintendent for Riverside Terrace and that I was reviewing our facility usage records and event coordination procedures as part of a routine administrative audit, and I asked if she would be willing to answer a few questions about how HOA committees typically structured their planning processes and how many planning meetings were usually necessary for events of various sizes and complexity levels. I kept the tone professional and bureaucratic, and I made no mention of Vanessa or Blake or any specific individuals. And I sent the email from my official building superintendent address rather than from my personal account so that the inquiry would appear to be purely administrative in nature. Within 2 hours, I received a response from Patricia saying that she would be happy to answer questions about event planning procedures and that she had worked with Riverside Terrace on multiple occasions and had found the community to be well organized and professional in their approach to event coordination. She included her phone number and suggested that I could call her if that would be more convenient than exchanging multiple emails, and I appreciated her responsiveness and her willingness to assist with what she assumed was a routine administrative inquiry. I called her number, and she answered promptly, and I introduced myself as Owen Garrett, the building superintendent, and I explained that I was trying to understand the normal workflow for event planning so that I could better coordinate facility maintenance schedules and equipment availability with the HOA committee calendar. Patricia was friendly and informative, and she explained that in her experience working with homeowner associations, the typical event planning process involved an initial meeting with the full committee to establish the event, concept, and budget and timeline, followed by 1 or 2 working sessions with a smaller coordination team to finalize vendor contracts and logistics details, and then usually 1 final walkthrough shortly before the event to confirm setup requirements and address any last-minute issues. She said that for most standard community events, like seasonal parties or fundraisers, the entire planning process could be completed with 3 to 4 meetings, spread over a period of several weeks, and that excessive meeting frequency usually indicated either poor planning efficiency or conflicts and disagreements among committee members that required extended negotiation and consensus building. I asked Patricia whether in her work with Riverside Terrace she had noticed any unusual patterns in terms of how often the volunteer coordinators met, or how the planning responsibilities were distributed among committee members. And she paused for a moment before saying that actually, now that I mentioned it, she had thought it was somewhat unusual that Blake Henley, the HOA president, had been so directly involved in detailed vendor coordination discussions, which would normally be handled by the volunteer coordinators while the board president focused on higher-level oversight and budget approval. Patricia said that Blake had attended several vendor meetings with Vanessa over the past year and that they had sometimes requested evening or early morning meeting times that were outside of normal business hours. And when Patricia had asked about the unusual scheduling, she had been told that both Blake and Vanessa had busy daytime calendars and needed to coordinate their volunteer work around their other commitments. I asked Patricia if she had records of how many meetings she had attended with Blake and Vanessa together, and whether she could provide approximate dates for those meetings, and she said that she maintained detailed client interaction logs for billing and contract documentation purposes, and that she could review those logs and send me a summary of her meeting history with Riverside Terrace representatives. I thanked her for her help, and I gave her my email address, and I explained that having accurate records of facility usage for vendor meetings would help me improve the building's scheduling systems and maintenance planning, and Patricia said she would compile the information and send it to me within the next day or 2. After I ended the call with Patricia, I felt satisfied that I had identified another source of independent corroboration that would document the frequency and nature of Blake and Vanessa's collaboration, and I recognized that vendor meeting records would be particularly valuable because they would show whether the number of planning sessions was consistent with what would normally be required for the events that were actually held, or whether there had been excessive meetings that suggested the events were being used as cover for other activities. I added a note to my evidence timeline indicating that vendor coordination records were pending and would be incorporated into the documentation once I received them from Patricia. I then turned my attention to the question of what I wanted to achieve through this evidence-gathering process, and what outcome I was hoping to accomplish beyond simply confirming my suspicions about Vanessa's affair with Blake. I realized that my objectives were both personal and institutional in the sense that I wanted to protect my own interests in any divorce or separation proceedings, but I also wanted to ensure that Blake faced appropriate consequences for misusing his HOA administrator privileges and for violating the trust that residents had placed in their board leadership. I understood that the HOA bylaws included ethics provisions that prohibited board members from using their positions for personal benefit or from engaging in conduct that brought disrepute to the association, and I knew that documented evidence of Blake using his administrator access to conduct an affair with a resident, while that resident's spouse was away on building maintenance calls, would constitute a clear violation of those ethics standards. I pulled up the HOA bylaws document on my laptop, and I reviewed the sections dealing with board member conduct and ethics complaints and removal procedures, and I discovered that any resident could file a formal ethics complaint against a board member by submitting written documentation to the board secretary along with supporting evidence, and that once a complaint was filed, the board was required to schedule a hearing within 30 days to review the allegations and determine whether disciplinary action was warranted. The bylaws specified that ethics hearings were open to all residents unless they involved personnel matters or legal issues that required confidential executive session, and that the board could impose sanctions ranging from formal censure to removal from office depending on the severity of the violation and the quality of evidence presented. I realized that filing an ethics complaint against Blake would serve multiple purposes, including creating an official record of his misconduct and forcing a public accounting of his actions, and potentially resulting in his removal from the HOA board, which would eliminate his administrator access privileges and would significantly damage his reputation within the community. I realized that filing an ethics complaint against Blake would serve multiple purposes, including creating an official record of his misconduct and forcing a public accounting of his actions, and potentially resulting in his removal from the HOA board, which would eliminate his administrator access privileges and would significantly damage his reputation within the community. And I understood that the public nature of an ethics hearing would also expose Vanessa's role in the affair and would undermine whatever narrative she had been constructing about being the victim of a cold and neglectful husband who had driven her to seek emotional connection elsewhere. I decided that I would prepare a formal ethics complaint that I would file with the board secretary after I had completed my evidence gathering and after I had the vendor coordination records from Patricia that would provide additional documentation of the excessive and inappropriate nature of Blake and Vanessa's collaborative activities. I spent the remainder of the afternoon drafting the ethics complaint document in a format that followed the guidelines specified in the HOA bylaws, and I structured the complaint around three main allegations, which were that Blake had misused his administrator access privileges by entering a resident's home without proper authorization or emergency justification, that Blake had engaged in deceptive conduct by scheduling and attending private meetings with a resident under the guise of HOA committee work when those meetings served personal rather than community purposes, and that Blake had violated the ethical standards expected of board leadership by conducting an affair with a married resident whose spouse was an employee of the community and whose trust in board integrity had been systematically betrayed. For each allegation, I included specific references to the supporting evidence, including the entry log data showing Blake's keycard scans at my townhome, the calendar entries showing the pattern of vague evening meetings with no specified location, the witness statement from Mr. Rourke describing the repeated pool gate meetings, and the vendor coordinator's observations about unusual meeting frequency and scheduling. I wrote the complaint in the same neutral, factual tone that I had used for my timeline narrative, and I avoided inflammatory language or personal attacks, and instead focused on documenting specific actions and patterns that violated clearly stated policies and ethical standards. I concluded the complaint by requesting that the board schedule a formal ethics hearing to review the evidence and determine appropriate disciplinary action, and I noted that I was prepared to present additional documentation and witness testimony if the board required further substantiation of the allegations. When I had completed the draft complaint, I saved it to my evidence folder, and I decided that I would wait until after my meeting with Vanessa the following evening before filing it officially, because I wanted to give her one opportunity to be honest about what had been happening and to acknowledge her role in the deception before I initiated formal proceedings that would make the situation public and irreversible. That evening, I received the vendor coordination records from Patricia via email, and the attached spreadsheet showed that she had attended 7 meetings with Riverside Terrace representatives over the past 12 months for events that included a summer barbecue and a holiday party, and a spring fundraiser and several smaller seasonal gatherings. Of those 7 meetings, 5 had included both Blake and Vanessa as the primary HOA contacts, and Patricia had noted in her records that 3 of those 5 meetings had been scheduled for evening hours at 7 or 8 o'clock, which she had flagged as unusual because most of her client meetings occurred during standard business hours between 9 and 5. Patricia had also included notes indicating that for 2 of the meetings, Blake and Vanessa had requested to meet at the downtown Harborview Boutique Hotel, which had a small conference room that could be reserved for business meetings, and she had noted that this location choice was atypical because most HOA planning sessions occurred at the community clubhouse or at the vendor's office rather than at neutral third-party venues. I cross-referenced the dates of Patricia's vendor meetings with my timeline spreadsheet, and I discovered that the 2 meetings held at the Harborview Boutique Hotel had occurred on dates that corresponded with some of the breakfast charges that I had documented in our joint bank account records, and this correlation suggested that Blake and Vanessa had been scheduling legitimate vendor coordination meetings at the hotel, and then had been staying at the hotel afterward or returning to the hotel the following morning for breakfast meetings that extended beyond the scope of the vendor discussions. I added Patricia's records to my evidence folder, and I updated my timeline spreadsheet to include the vendor meeting dates and locations. And the pattern that emerged showed a sophisticated system of using real committee work as cover for extended private time together that could be justified to spouses and colleagues as necessary volunteer obligations. I also noticed that Patricia had included in her notes a comment that during one of the evening meetings at the hotel, Blake and Vanessa had seemed distracted and had requested that the vendor discussion be kept brief because they had other matters to attend to that evening, and Patricia had wondered at the time whether there was some kind of community crisis or urgent board business that required their attention, but she had not asked for details because she preferred to maintain professional boundaries with her clients. This observation from an independent third party, who had no stake in my personal situation and no reason to mischaracterize what she had witnessed, provided additional credibility to the overall pattern of evidence and demonstrated that the unusual nature of Blake and Vanessa's interactions had been noticeable even to people who were not looking for signs of misconduct or deception. The following evening, I drove to my townhome to meet with Vanessa as we had arranged, and as I parked in the driveway, I took a moment to review my evidence folder on my phone and to remind myself of the key facts and timeline that I wanted to discuss with her before we moved into any conversation about separation logistics or division of property. I walked up to the front door and let myself in using my key, and I found Vanessa sitting at the dining room table with a notepad and pen, and what appeared to be a list of topics or discussion points that she had prepared in advance. She greeted me cordially but without warmth, and she gestured for me to sit down across from her, and I could see that she was approaching this conversation as a business negotiation rather than as an emotional reckoning or an opportunity for honesty and accountability. I sat down, and before Vanessa could begin working through her prepared list of topics, I said that I wanted to start by asking her some questions about her schedule and her committee work over the past several months because I had noticed some inconsistencies in our shared calendar and our joint financial records that I was hoping she could help me understand. Vanessa's expression became slightly defensive, and she asked what kind of inconsistencies I was referring to, and I responded by pulling out my phone and opening the folder containing the bank transaction screenshots showing the repeated breakfast charges at the Harborview Boutique Hotel. I placed my phone on the table between us with the screen visible, and I asked Vanessa if she could explain why there were 12 breakfast charges at a downtown hotel over a 90-day period when she had never mentioned having regular breakfast meetings in that area, and when the hotel was located nowhere near any of the venues or facilities where she typically conducted her volunteer coordination work. Vanessa looked at the phone screen, and I watched her face carefully as she processed what she was seeing and calculated how to respond, and after a moment, she said that those charges were from vendor coordination meetings that sometimes extended over breakfast hours because she and other committee members had busy schedules and needed to use early morning time slots to fit in their volunteer obligations. I nodded as though I was considering this explanation, and then I asked why the meetings had been held at a hotel rather than at the community clubhouse or at a coffee shop or at any of the other more convenient and less expensive locations that would serve the same purpose. And Vanessa hesitated before saying that the hotel had a conference room that provided privacy and professional atmosphere for discussions with vendors who expected a certain level of formality and organization. I then asked Vanessa who else had attended these breakfast meetings with her, and whether there were committee meeting minutes or attendance records that would document who had participated in these vendor coordination sessions. Vanessa's expression became more guarded, and she said that usually it was just herself and Blake because he was the board president and needed to be involved in major vendor decisions and budget approvals, and that they did not always keep formal minutes for small working sessions that were focused on logistics rather than on policy decisions. I asked why Blake's involvement was necessary for routine vendor coordination when that responsibility typically fell to volunteer coordinators like herself, and when the board president's role was usually limited to reviewing final proposals and authorizing expenditures rather than attending detailed planning meetings. Vanessa said that Blake preferred to be hands-on with vendor relationships because he had professional experience in contract negotiations and because he wanted to make sure the community was getting good value for its event budgets. And she added somewhat defensively that she did not understand why I was interrogating her about committee work procedures when we were supposed to be discussing our separation arrangements. I responded calmly that I was asking these questions because the pattern of breakfast meetings at downtown hotels seemed inconsistent with what would normally be required for HOA volunteer work, and because the dates and times of these meetings corresponded with periods when I had been away from home on early maintenance shifts, and I wanted to understand whether there was a connection between her committee schedule and my work schedule that went beyond simple coincidence. Vanessa's face flushed, and she said that she resented my implication that there was anything inappropriate about her volunteer work, and that if I was going to accuse her of something, I should be direct rather than asking leading questions designed to trap her into admissions. I said that I was not trying to trap her, but rather was trying to give her an opportunity to explain some patterns that appeared problematic when viewed alongside other information that I had gathered, and then I placed my phone back on the table and opened the folder containing the doorbell camera screenshots showing Vanessa returning home at 2 and 3 in the morning, accompanied by a male figure with an HOA administrator badge. Vanessa stared at the images on the phone screen, and her expression shifted from defensive irritation to something closer to shock or panic, as she realized that I had been systematically documenting her activities and that I had evidence that went far beyond vague suspicions or jealous speculation. She started to say something and then stopped and looked away from the phone, and I could see her mind working to construct an explanation that would account for what the images showed without admitting to anything that would undermine her position in separation negotiations. After a long silence, she said that there had been some late-night emergency committee meetings to address resident complaints and facility issues, and that Blake had sometimes given her a ride home when those meetings ran very late and when it was not safe for her to walk alone through the community after midnight. I asked why these emergency committee meetings had not been documented in the shared community calendar and why no other committee members or residents had been notified about urgent issues that required middle-of-the-night discussions, and I also asked why Blake's administrator access had been used to unlock our townhome smart lock on the same nights when these emergency meetings had allegedly occurred. Vanessa's face went pale, and she asked how I knew about Blake's access to our townhome, and I explained that as building superintendent, I had routine access to the entry log system for security and maintenance purposes, and that I had reviewed the logs as part of my normal administrative responsibilities and had noticed the pattern of Blake's late-night entries to our residence during my documented absences. Vanessa stood up abruptly from the dining room table and said that she was not going to continue this conversation while I was acting like an investigator or prosecutor rather than like a husband who was trying to work through a difficult situation, and she said that if I wanted to have a productive discussion about separation terms, then I needed to stop making accusations and implications and instead focus on the practical matters that needed to be resolved. I remained seated at the dining room table, and I said in the same calm, measured tone that I had been maintaining throughout the conversation that I was willing to discuss separation terms, but that those discussions needed to be based on honest acknowledgement of what had actually been happening rather than on false narratives about emotional neglect and marital dissatisfaction that served to justify behavior that Vanessa did not want to admit to or take responsibility for. I explained that I had spent the past several days carefully documenting a pattern of deception that included late-night entries to our home, by Blake using his administrator access privileges, hotel breakfast meetings that were scheduled during my early work shifts, vaguely described evening planning sessions that had no specified location or legitimate committee purpose, and witness observations of repeated private meetings at the community pool gate during hours when the facility was officially closed to residents. Vanessa turned back toward me, and her expression had shifted from defensive anger to something that looked more like resignation or exhaustion, and she asked what I wanted from her and what I was planning to do with all of the evidence I had gathered and whether I was intending to humiliate her publicly or to destroy Blake's position in the community as some kind of revenge for whatever she had done that I found objectionable. I responded that I did not want revenge, but that I did want honesty and accountability, and that I believed both Vanessa and Blake had violated trust and had misused their positions and their access in ways that went beyond personal infidelity and extended into ethical misconduct that affected the entire community and not just our private marriage. I explained that I had already drafted a formal ethics complaint against Blake that documented his misuse of administrator privileges and his pattern of deceptive conduct in scheduling and attending meetings that served personal purposes while being characterized as official HOA business, and that I intended to file this complaint with the board secretary within the next few days, regardless of what happened between Vanessa and me in our personal separation negotiations. I said that the ethics complaint would trigger a mandatory hearing that would be open to all residents, and that would require Blake to answer questions and respond to evidence in a public forum where his explanations and justifications would be evaluated by the full board and by community members who had trusted him to act with integrity and to use his authority responsibly. Vanessa sat back down in her chair, and her hands were shaking slightly as she asked whether the ethics complaint would include information about her involvement with Blake or whether it would focus solely on his misuse of administrator access and board authority. I said that the complaint as currently drafted focused primarily on Blake's violations of his fiduciary and ethical responsibilities as a board member, but that the evidence necessarily included documentation of his meetings and communications with her, because those interactions were the context in which the violations had occurred, and that any hearing examining Blake's conduct would inevitably require discussion of who he had been meeting with and why, and whether those meetings had been appropriately characterized and documented. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that she wanted to explain what had actually happened between herself and Blake, and how the relationship had developed, and what her motivations and intentions had been, and she asked if I would be willing to listen without interrupting, and without immediately using whatever she said as ammunition in the ethics complaint or in divorce proceedings. I said that I would listen to whatever she wanted to tell me, but that I could not promise that information she provided would not influence my decisions about how to proceed, and that if she was going to be honest now after months of deception, then that honesty needed to be complete and detailed rather than being a carefully edited version designed to minimize her culpability or to preserve her reputation. Vanessa began by saying that her relationship with Blake had started approximately 4 months ago when they had been working together on planning the spring fundraiser event, and had discovered that they had similar communication styles and similar perspectives on community engagement and volunteer leadership. She said that initially their interactions had been purely professional and focused on event logistics and vendor coordination, but that over time their conversations had become more personal, and they had begun sharing frustrations about their respective marriages and their feelings of being undervalued or misunderstood by their spouses. Vanessa said that Blake had told her that his marriage had become distant and perfunctory, and that his wife was more interested in her own career and social activities than in maintaining emotional intimacy with him, and that he had found in Vanessa someone who understood the importance of community involvement and who appreciated the time and effort that volunteer leadership required. Vanessa continued by explaining that she had similarly felt that I was emotionally unavailable and overly focused on my building superintendent responsibilities, and that our marriage had become more like a functional partnership for managing household logistics than like a romantic relationship with passion and emotional depth. She said that her conversations with Blake had made her feel valued and interesting in ways that she had not felt in our marriage for several years, and that what had started as friendly collaborative work had gradually evolved into something that felt more intimate and more emotionally significant than either of them had initially intended or anticipated. I listened to this explanation without interrupting, as I had promised, and I noted that Vanessa was using language that characterized the affair as something that had happened to her rather than as a series of deliberate choices that she had made to pursue emotional and presumably physical intimacy with another man while remaining married to me, and while actively concealing the nature and extent of that relationship. When she paused, I asked her directly whether the relationship with Blake had included physical intimacy or whether it had remained at the level of emotional connection and intense conversation, and Vanessa hesitated before admitting that yes, there had been physical intimacy, but that it had only progressed to that point within the past 6 weeks, and that prior to that, the relationship had been primarily emotional and conversational. I asked Vanessa where the physical encounters had occurred and how they had managed the logistics of meeting privately given that both of them were married and living in the same community where their movements and interactions would be visible to neighbors and other residents. Vanessa said that they had initially used Blake's administrator access to meet at my townhome during my late work shifts because it provided privacy and because Blake could justify his presence in the building by claiming he was conducting routine facility inspections or responding to maintenance concerns that I had reported. She said that they had also met several times at the Harbor View Boutique Hotel, either very early in the morning before anyone else in the community was awake or late in the evening after legitimate vendor coordination meetings had concluded, and that Blake had paid for the hotel room charges using his personal credit card rather than using any HOA funds or shared marital accounts. I pointed out that our joint bank account showed multiple breakfast charges at the Harbor View Hotel, which indicated that Vanessa had been present at the hotel during morning hours and had used our shared financial resources to purchase meals during or after meetings with Blake, and Vanessa acknowledged that yes, she had sometimes stayed at the hotel for breakfast after early morning meetings, and that she had not thought carefully about the implications of those charges appearing in our joint account records, because she had assumed I was not monitoring the account closely and would not question routine food purchases. I said that this assumption revealed a significant level of carelessness or contempt for my awareness and my right to know how our shared resources were being used, and that the fact that she had been comfortable charging affair-related expenses to our joint account suggested that she had not been particularly concerned about being discovered or about the consequences that might follow from her deception. Vanessa said that she understood how it looked, and that she recognized she had made poor decisions and had handled the situation badly, but that she wanted me to understand that her relationship with Blake had not been motivated by malice toward me or by a desire to hurt me, but rather by a genuine need for emotional connection and validation that she had not been finding in our marriage. I responded that I understood she had felt emotionally unfulfilled and that I was willing to accept that I might have contributed to that feeling through my communication style or my work priorities, but that the appropriate response to marital dissatisfaction was to communicate clearly about needs and concerns and to seek counseling or to make an honest decision to end the marriage, rather than to conduct a months-long affair while simultaneously living with me and accepting the benefits of our shared household and our financial partnership. I asked Vanessa what her intentions had been regarding our marriage and whether she had been planning to eventually leave me for Blake or whether she had been intending to maintain both relationships indefinitely by continuing to conceal the affair and to use volunteer work as cover for her meetings with him. Vanessa said that she honestly had not thought that far ahead and that she had been taking things one day at a time and trying to balance her conflicting feelings and obligations without forcing a crisis or making irreversible decisions. She admitted that the yard confrontation 2 nights ago had been somewhat staged because Blake had encouraged her to create a public separation scenario that would make it easier for both of them to transition into a more open relationship without having to explain suddenly why they were spending time together after both of their marriages ended, and that the plan had been for her to establish a narrative about my emotional coldness and neglect that would justify her decision to end our marriage and would minimize questions about whether there had been someone else involved. I found this admission significant because it confirmed my earlier suspicion that the yard confrontation had been carefully planned rather than being a spontaneous emotional explosion, and it demonstrated that both Vanessa and Blake had been actively collaborating to manage the narrative and to control how their relationship would be perceived by the community and by their respective spouses. I asked Vanessa whether she understood that Blake's role in planning and encouraging the staged confrontation constituted additional evidence of his misuse of his position and his manipulation of community dynamics for personal benefit, and whether she was prepared to acknowledge that she had been complicit in that manipulation by agreeing to perform the scene that would serve Blake's interests as much as, or more than, it served her own. Vanessa looked uncomfortable and said that she had not thought about it in those terms, and that she had trusted Blake's judgment about how to handle the situation because he had more experience with community politics and reputation management. I said that this response suggested that Vanessa had allowed herself to be used by Blake as much as she had been an active participant in the deception, and that she needed to consider whether Blake's primary concern had been protecting their relationship or had been protecting his own position and authority within the HOA structure by making sure that if the affair was discovered, he could claim that Vanessa had been the aggressor or the instigator, rather than acknowledging his own role in pursuing and maintaining the relationship. Vanessa was silent for a long moment, and I could see her processing this possibility and reconsidering some of the assumptions she had made about Blake's motivations and priorities. And then she asked what I wanted her to do now, and whether there was any way to resolve this situation without destroying both her reputation and Blake's position in the community. I said that I was not primarily concerned with destroying anyone's reputation, but that I was committed to ensuring that there were appropriate consequences for the misuse of authority and the violation of trust that had occurred, and that those consequences needed to be proportional to the seriousness of the violations and needed to serve as a deterrent against similar conduct by future board members who might be tempted to use their administrator privileges for personal benefit. I explained that my plan was to file the ethics complaint within the next 48 hours and to request a hearing that would allow the evidence to be presented and evaluated by the full board in accordance with the procedures specified in the HOA bylaws. I explained that my plan was to file the ethics complaint within the next 48 hours and to request a hearing that would allow the evidence to be presented and evaluated by the full board in accordance with the procedures specified in the HOA bylaws. And I said that Vanessa had a choice about how involved she wanted to be in that process and whether she wanted to provide her own statement, acknowledging the facts and taking responsibility for her role in the relationship, or whether she preferred to remain silent and let Blake answer for his conduct without her active participation. Vanessa asked what would happen to Blake if the ethics complaint resulted in a finding of misconduct and whether he would lose his position as HOA president or face other penalties beyond public embarrassment and damage to his reputation within the community. I explained that according to the HOA bylaws, the board had the authority to impose sanctions ranging from formal censure to removal from office, depending on the severity of the violation and the board's assessment of whether the member could continue to serve effectively after the misconduct had been exposed. And I said that given the nature of Blake's violations, which included misuse of administrator access credentials and deceptive conduct in scheduling meetings that served personal rather than community purposes, it seemed likely that the board would vote for removal rather than for lesser sanctions that would allow him to remain in a position of authority. I added that removal from the board would also result in revocation of Blake's administrator privileges, which would eliminate his override access to residential units and secured facilities, and would significantly reduce his ability to move through the community without being observed or questioned by other residents. Vanessa said that she understood the consequences for Blake, but she wanted to know what I expected would happen to her own reputation and her position as volunteer coordinator once the affair became public knowledge through the ethics hearing process, and whether I was intentionally trying to damage her social standing in the community as punishment for her infidelity, or whether that damage was simply an unavoidable side effect of holding Blake accountable for his misconduct. I responded that my primary focus was on Blake's abuse of his board authority rather than on Vanessa's personal choices, but that it was impossible to document Blake's violations without also revealing the context in which those violations occurred and the identity of the person he had been meeting with during the late-night entries and the vaguely scheduled planning sessions. I said that Vanessa's reputation would inevitably suffer once the details became public, but that the extent of that damage would depend partly on how she chose to conduct herself going forward and whether she demonstrated genuine remorse and acceptance of responsibility, or whether she attempted to deflect blame and to portray herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Vanessa asked whether I would be willing to delay filing the ethics complaint for a few weeks, to give her time to move out of the townhome and to establish some separation between herself and the immediate community scrutiny that would follow once the hearing was scheduled, and I said that I was not willing to delay the complaint because every day that Blake remained in his position with full administrator access was another day in which he could potentially misuse those privileges or could take steps to conceal or destroy evidence that might be relevant to the board's investigation. Vanessa stood up from the table again and walked to the window overlooking the front yard where the confrontation had occurred 2 nights earlier, and she said quietly that she had not intended for things to become this complicated or this destructive, and that she had genuinely believed that her relationship with Blake was built on real emotional connection rather than on convenience and opportunity and mutual benefit. I said that intentions and beliefs were less important than actions and consequences when it came to evaluating ethical conduct and personal responsibility, and that regardless of how Vanessa had characterized the relationship in her own mind, the documented facts showed a pattern of systematic deception and misuse of community resources and volunteer roles that had extended over several months and had involved careful planning and coordination to avoid detection. I told Vanessa that I would be moving my belongings out of the townhome over the next few days and that I expected her to begin looking for alternative housing arrangements because I intended to pursue separation terms that would allow me to remain in the residence given that my building superintendent position required me to live within the community and that Vanessa's volunteer coordinator role could be performed from any location. Vanessa turned back from the window and asked whether I had already consulted with an attorney about separation and divorce procedures. And I said that I had not yet retained legal representation, but that I would be doing so within the next week once I had filed the ethics complaint and had a clearer sense of how the community response would unfold. Vanessa said that she would agree to move out of the townhome if that was what I wanted, but that she hoped we could handle the financial separation and property division through mediation rather than through adversarial legal proceedings that would increase costs and animosity for both of us. I said that I was open to mediation as long as Vanessa was prepared to be completely honest about all of our shared assets and liabilities and was not planning to conceal resources or to claim expenses related to her affair as legitimate marital debts that should be divided equally between us. Vanessa assured me that she had no intention of being dishonest about our financial situation and that she recognized she had already caused enough damage through her deception without compounding it by attempting to manipulate the separation process. I gathered my phone and my notepad from the dining room table, and I told Vanessa that I would be in touch within the next few days to coordinate the logistics of moving my remaining belongings and to discuss the timeline for her finding new housing, and I said that if she wanted to provide a written statement to accompany the ethics complaint that acknowledged her role in the relationship and expressed remorse for her participation in the deception, then I would be willing to include that statement as part of the documentation I submitted to the board secretary. Vanessa said she would think about whether to provide such a statement and would let me know her decision before I filed the complaint. As I was walking toward the front door to leave, Vanessa called after me and said that despite everything that had happened and all the mistakes she had made, she wanted me to know that she had genuinely cared about me during the years we had been together and that she was sorry for the pain and betrayal that her actions had caused. I turned back and looked at her standing in the middle of the living room that we had shared for 3 years, and I said that I appreciated her apology, but that apologies without meaningful changes in behavior or without acceptance of appropriate consequences were essentially empty gestures that served to make the person offering them feel better without actually repairing the damage that had been done. I left the townhome and drove back to Iris's residence, where I spent the evening finalizing the ethics complaint document and organizing all of my evidence files into a format that could be easily presented to the board secretary and subsequently to the full board during the hearing that would follow once the complaint was officially filed. The following morning, I printed multiple copies of the complaint along with supporting documentation, including the entry log reports and the doorbell camera screenshots and the witness statement from Mr. Rourke and the vendor coordination records from Patricia and the shared calendar exports showing the pattern of vaguely described evening meetings, and I placed all of these materials in a large envelope that I sealed and labeled with the board secretary's name and the designation that it contained an official ethics complaint requiring board review and hearing scheduling. I drove to the Community Administration Building, where the HOA maintained a small office for processing resident requests and complaints, and for handling routine correspondence with board members and committee coordinators, and I asked the administrative assistant who staffed the front desk whether the board secretary was available to accept delivery of an official ethics complaint that required time-stamped receipt acknowledgement. The administrative assistant said that the board secretary, whose name was Judge Patricia Brennan, was currently in a meeting but would be available within the next 30 minutes if I was willing to wait. And I said that yes, I would wait because I wanted to hand-deliver the complaint directly, rather than leaving it with administrative staff who might not understand the urgency and importance of proper documentation procedures. While I waited in the small reception area, I reviewed my evidence folder one final time to make sure that I had included all relevant documentation and that the timeline narrative was clear and accurate and would allow anyone reviewing the materials to understand the sequence of events and the pattern of misconduct without requiring extensive verbal explanation from me. After approximately 25 minutes, Judge Brennan emerged from the back office area and greeted me professionally and asked how she could assist me, and I explained that I was there to file a formal ethics complaint against a board member in accordance with the procedures specified in the HOA bylaws, and that I had prepared comprehensive documentation to support the allegations detailed in the complaint. Judge Brennan's expression became more serious as she understood the nature of my visit, and she invited me to step into a private conference room where we could discuss the complaint away from the reception area where other residents might overhear sensitive information about board member conduct. Once we were seated in the conference room, I handed her the sealed envelope containing the complaint document and all supporting evidence, and I explained that the complaint alleged that Blake Henley had misused his administrator access privileges and had engaged in deceptive conduct that violated the ethical standards expected of HOA board leadership. Judge Brennan opened the envelope and began reviewing the complaint document while I sat quietly and waited for her initial reaction, and I could see her expression shifting from professional neutrality to evident concern as she read through the allegations and began examining the supporting documentation. After several minutes, Judge Brennan looked up from the documents and asked whether I understood that filing an ethics complaint would trigger a mandatory investigation and hearing process that would become part of the official HOA records and would be open to all residents unless the board voted to conduct portions of the hearing in closed executive session. I confirmed that yes, I understood the public nature of the process and that I was prepared to present all of the evidence I had gathered and to answer questions from board members and from Blake himself if he chose to challenge any of the factual claims contained in the complaint. Judge Brennan said that based on her preliminary review of the documentation, the allegations appeared to be serious and well substantiated, and that she would be obligated to schedule a hearing within the 30-day time frame specified in the bylaws. She asked whether I had consulted with an attorney before filing the complaint, and whether I understood that Blake might choose to pursue legal action against me if he believed that any of the allegations were false or defamatory. And I explained that I had not yet retained legal counsel, but that every factual claim in the complaint was supported by documentary evidence or witness testimony that could be independently verified, and that I had been careful to avoid making speculative accusations or character judgments that were not directly supported by the documented facts. Judge Brennan nodded and said that she appreciated the thorough and professional manner in which I had prepared the complaint materials, and that the board would take the allegations very seriously given the nature of the violations and the clear documentation of administrator privilege misuse. Judge Brennan stamped the complaint document with an official received marking that included the current date and time and her signature as board secretary, and she provided me with a copy of the stamped document as proof that the complaint had been properly filed and logged into the HOA records system. She explained that she would notify Blake within 48 hours that an ethics complaint had been filed against him and that he would be given an opportunity to review the allegations and to prepare a response before the hearing was scheduled, and that all residents would receive notice of the hearing date and time at least 2 weeks in advance so that anyone who wished to attend or to provide relevant testimony would have adequate opportunity to arrange their schedules. I thanked Judge Brennan for her professionalism and for her commitment to following proper procedures, and I left the administration building knowing that the formal accountability process had now been initiated and that Blake would soon be facing public scrutiny and potential removal from his position of authority within the community where he had betrayed the trust of residents who had relied on his integrity and ethical leadership,